single major political or economic event. Radio Algeria International, our voice in the world.
This is the English service of Radio Algeria International. It's time for the news.
In today's top stories, the President of the Republic, Abdelmajid Tebboune, Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, Minister of National Defense, presided over at the National Army Club here in Algiers a reception to mark the 69th anniversary of the outbreak of the November Glorious Revolution. In the Gaza Strip, at least 8,800 Palestinians have been slaughtered in Zionist attacks on Gaza since October 7th. The head of communications at the Palestine Red Crescent Society has said that the worsening humanitarian situation in Gaza and the word silence on the unprecedented massacres being committed against the Gaza Strip augurs the worst disaster of this century. And today marks the 106th anniversary of the Declaration of Balfour, marking the beginning of the tragic and catastrophic events that occurred in 1948 that ultimately led to the displacement of the Palestinian people, the rightful owners of the land and rights. Hello and welcome to Radio Algeria International. I'm Jamal Semeni. Starting today's news, the President of the Republic, Abdelmajid Tebboune, Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, Minister of National Defense, presided over at the National Army Club here in Algiers a reception to mark the 69th anniversary of the outbreak of the Glorious Revolution of November 1st, 1954, in honor of senior members of the National People's Army in activity and retired, Said Bougazi reports.
The President of the Republic was welcomed at the entrance to the National Army Club by the Chief of Staff of the National People's Army, Army General Said Shingriha. The ceremony, part of the great traditions of the National People's Army, was attended by the Speaker of the Council of the Nation, the Speaker of the National People's Assembly, the Prime Minister, the President of the Constitutional Court, and the members of the government, as well as Army General Ben Ali, Commander of the Republican Guard, the Secretary General of the Ministry of National Defense, the commanders of the forces, the Commander of the National Gendarmerie, the Commander of the 1st Military Region, the heads of departments, directors and heads of central services of the Ministry of National Defense, and the General Staff of the National People's Army, along with senior government officials, national figures and war veterans, said the same source. At the start of the ceremony, the audience listened to the national anthem and watched a documentary film entitled November, Our Doctrine, produced by the Directorate of Information and Communication of the General Staff of the National People's Army, before visiting a photo exhibition retracing the different stages of our glorious revolution from its inception to independence.
The head of state has received a message of good wishes from the French counterpart Emmanuel Macron on the occasion of the 69th anniversary of the outbreak of the Glorious Revolution, in which he wished him and Algeria greater prosperity, underlining that the two countries share the same ambitions, as well as of a process of rapprochement strengthened by the signing of the Algiers Declaration. On the issue of remembrance, the French president stressed the need to continue working within the framework of the joint commission set up by the two presidents. In the end, President Macron renewed his best wishes to the Algerian people and to the President of the Republic on the occasion of the anniversary of the outbreak of the Algerian Revolution. Meanwhile, the President of the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic and Secretary General of the Polisario Front, Brahim Ghali, has said that Algeria's glorious revolution occupies a special place in the history of humanity as a whole. In a message of good wishes addressed to the President on the occasion of the 69th anniversary of the outbreak of the glorious War of Liberation, Brahim Ghali said that this memorable date will continue to occupy a special space not only in the history of Algeria and its valiant people, but also in that of humanity as a whole. It marked the beginning of the War of Liberation, which forever consolidated the need for the triumph of the free and sovereign will of the fighting peoples, victims of injustice and oppression, and the inevitable defeat of the forces of injustice, tyranny, and colonization. Now to the conflict, in Gaza, at least 8,805 Palestinians have been slaughtered in Zionist attacks in Gaza since October 7th. Gaza officials say 195 have been killed, 120 are missing in a Zionist bombing of Jabalia refugee camp, which the UN says may be disproportionate attacks that could amount to war crimes. Turkish-Palestinian Friendship Hospital, Gaza's only medical facility serving cancer patients, is forced to shut down after running out of fuel. The Indonesian hospital is running on backup generator. The Gaza Borders and Crossings Authority has released a list of 596 foreign and dual nationals who will be allowed to leave through the Rafah crossing today after a first group including 81 critically ill patients crossed on Wednesday. The member of the General Secretariat of the Palestinian Journalists Union, Omar Nazel, has denounced that since October 7th, the occupation has deliberately targeted Palestinian journalists in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank by bombing their headquarters and their homes with their families to hide the ongoing genocide. Mariam Bershi tells us more in this report.
Omar Nazel indicated that the Zionist occupation seeks to hide the serious abuses perpetrated against the Palestinian people by targeting Palestinian journalists on the spot. The Palestinian Unionist said that the occupation has killed 25 Palestinian journalists so far and 11 people working in the information sector, without forgetting the families of 30 of our colleagues killed in the direct bombardments in the Gaza Strip, adding that the homes of 35 other journalists have been destroyed in the strikes. Omar Nazel added that journalists in the West Bank have not been spared by the abuses of the Zionist entity, noting that since October 7th, 18 journalists have been arrested and their colleagues meet hard working conditions on account of the restrictions imposed by the occupation's checkpoints and the shutting down of the press agency and radio station broadcasting from the city of El Khalil. Regarding the bad working conditions of the journalists in Gaza, Mr. Nazel noted that the latter have been forced to leave their offices and workplace, targeted since the first days by bombardments, adding that 50 press offices and headquarters have been destroyed. He deplored the disastrous working conditions of his colleagues in Gaza, in addition to the long internet and electricity cuts, and the absence of any commodities, including water and food, hence the weak media content from Gaza. The Zionist authorities also denied access to foreign journalists to prevent them from covering the current aggression on the besieged enclave.
The UN and several NGOs warn of the catastrophic humanitarian situation in the besieged Palestinian territory, which numbers 2.4 million of inhabitants. The head of the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA, Filipe Lazzarini, said Wednesday during his first visit to Gaza since the start of the Zionist aggression that the scale of the tragedy is unprecedented. More than 70 UNRWA personnel have been killed in Gaza since October 7th, he underlined. More than 70 UNRWA staff members have been killed in Gaza. He also deplored the fact that humanitarian aid was not sufficient to meet the considerable needs of the people of Gaza. The head of the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees said during his visit to the Gaza Strip that his teams would stay with the Palestinians in this territory despite the war launched by the occupation against the Palestinian people in Gaza. The head of communications at the Palestine Red Crescent Society, Rail El-Nims, has said that the worsening humanitarian situation in Gaza and the word silence on the unprecedented massacres being committed against the Gaza Strip augurs the worst disaster of this century. Said Bourazi has more details.
In a statement to the APS news agency, Raed El-Nims said that the Zionist occupation has intensified its strikes against Palestinian civilians since last Friday, systematically targeting residential buildings with a view to causing more casualties alongside the periodic cutting of communication networks and internet in order to create a blackout on its appalling crimes. In recent hours, the Gaza Strip has witnessed several massacres against defenseless Palestinians, the latest being the carnage of Fallujah in the Jabalia camps on Wednesday morning, which left dozens of martyrs, the same official said, adding that this was the second bombardment of the camp after Tuesday's carnage, in addition to other massacres that left no fewer than 400 martyrs Tuesday night. In this respect, Ra'id al-Nims warned of the repercussions of fuel shortages in many hospitals against the backdrop of the latest dangerous developments and the increase in the intensity of the Zionist aggression. Our hospitals are working in disastrous conditions and beyond their capacity, and despite everything, the hospitals are admitting more and more wounded despite running out of fuel, which augurs a real catastrophe, the same Palestinian official deplored. Ra'id al-Nims called on all countries and UN bodies to intervene to stop this iniquitous aggression before the clinics and hospitals in the Gaza Strip become mass graves for all.
Egypt is going to evacuate approximately 7,000 foreigners and dual nationality holders from the Gaza Strip, which faces a Zionist aggression since October 7th, has announced the Egyptian Minister of Foreign Affairs the day after the first evacuation from the south of the Palestinian territory. During a meeting with foreign diplomats, the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Ismail Khairat, has declared that Egypt has prepared to facilitate the welcoming and to evacuate some foreign citizens of Gaza by the Rafah crossing point. Now, the NGO Médecins Sans Frontières has affirmed that more than 20,000 injured people are still in the Gaza Strip despite the first evacuations Wednesday to Egypt of Palestinian patients and foreigners of dual nationals. More than 20,000 injured remain in Gaza with limited access to medical care due to the siege and constant bombardments by the Zionist army. Médecins Sans Frontières, which specified that the 22 employees of its international staff had been able to leave Gaza via the Rafah border crossing, demanded that a greater number of inhabitants of the Palestinian territory be evacuated. Now, China assumed the presidency of the UN Security Council for November on Wednesday. China's UN ambassador said the Gaza conflict will be a focal point during the conflict's proceedings.
The top priority for our presidency and also for the Security Council as a whole currently is to tackle the Israel-Palestinian question, namely the Gaza conflict, which is going on in the Middle East. For the presidency, what we will continue to work is to make further efforts to make sure that the Council can play a responsible and meaningful role in particularly calling for ceasefire, protecting the civilians, and avoiding or preventing the further deterioration of the tension and also further humanitarian catastrophes. And the Council has been working on a draft resolution for quite a while. I know that the current deadlocked situation is disappointing, but for the Chinese presidency, we have no intention to give up, and we will continue to work with Council members together along that direction.
Today marks the 106th anniversary of the insurance of the fateful promise by former British Foreign Minister Arthur Balfour on November 2nd, 1917. Mariam Bershi.
This declaration marked the beginning of the tragic and catastrophic events that occurred in 1948 that ultimately led to the displacement of the Palestinian people, the rightful owners of the land and rights. It resulted in the denial of their legitimate rights and establishment of the Israeli colonial occupation state based on colonial settlement policies, military aggression, forced displacement, ethnic cleansing, land confiscation, property destruction, and the Judaization of the holy city of Al-Quds. This painful anniversary coincided with the ongoing crisis in the occupied Palestinian territory, especially in the Gaza Strip, which is witnessing the escalation of killing, organized terrorism, displacement, and the deliberate destruction of residential buildings, schools, hospitals, places of worship, and infrastructure. These actions constitute war crimes and crimes against humanity perpetrated by the Israeli occupation. Unfortunately, it highlights the failure of the international community to carry out its duties and assume its responsibilities in putting an end to this Israeli military aggression, providing protection for the Palestinian people, and obliging Israel, the occupying power, to comply with the principles of international law and relevant United Nations resolutions. On this occasion, which still represents a dark mark in history, memory, and human conscience, and a setback to the values of freedom, justice, and international legitimacy, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, OIC, expresses its reverence and appreciation for the steadfastness and sacrifices of the Palestinian people over decades. The OIC reaffirms its permanent commitment to supporting their just struggle to restore their legitimate national rights. On this fateful anniversary, the OIC called upon the international community to correct this historical injustice, shoulder its responsibilities in ending the Israeli occupation, and enable the Palestinian people to regain their legitimate rights, including their right to return and realize the establishment of the independent state on the borders of June 4, 1967, with its Al Quds as its capital. This should be achieved within the framework of the vision of a two-state solution based on the relevant United Nations resolutions and the Arab Peace Initiative.
U.S. President Joe Biden has called for a pause in the Israeli-Gaza conflict. The president was making a campaign speech in Minneapolis when a heckler urged him to call for a ceasefire.
Today, thanks to concerted American leadership, we're in a situation where safe passage for wounded Palestinians and foreign nationals to exit Gaza has started. American citizens are able to exit today as part of the first group of probably over 1,000. We'll see more of this process going on in the coming days. Working nonstop to get Americans out of Gaza as soon and as safely as possible. This is the result of intense and urgent American diplomacy with our partners in the region. At the same time, we're continuing working to significantly step up the flow of critical humanitarian assistance into Gaza. The number of trucks entering Gaza continues to increase significantly, but we still have a long way to go. The United States is going to continue to drive humanitarian support for innocent people in Gaza who need help, and they do need help.
U.S. Senator Bernie Sanders says first priority in Gaza must be to stop the bombing. Amid mounting global demands for a ceasefire, he advocated for a humanitarian pause and an end to Israel's indiscriminate air assaults.
The situation in Gaza today is a disaster. Congress must take action. The administration must take action. The world must take action. Many hundreds of thousands of innocent men, women, and children in Gaza are on the brink. Over the past 3 weeks, it is estimated that some 8,000 people in Gaza have been killed in bombings, including more than 3,000 children, and far more have been wounded. The humanitarian crisis is dire and getting worse by the minute. There must be a humanitarian pause now so that sufficient supplies, food, water, medicine, fuel, can reach the people of Gaza. If not, thousands more will die needlessly. We cannot allow that to happen.
The director of the New York office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Greg Mohiber, has announced his resignation from his post in protest against the powerlessness of the UN to stop the genocide being committed by the Zionist entity against the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and the occupied West Bank, and the complicity of several states with the occupier. This is Radio Algeria International. Stay tuned.
The foundational events of the Nakba took place during and shortly after the 1948 Palestine War, including 78% of mandatory Palestine being declared as Israel, the expulsion of 800,000 Palestinians, the related depopulation and destruction of over 500 Palestinian villages by Zionist armed forces, and subsequent geographical erasure, the denial of the Palestinian right of return, the creation of permanent Palestinian refugees, and the shattering of Palestinian society. The expulsion of the Palestinians has since been described as an ethnic cleansing. Before the Nakba, Palestine was a multi-ethnic and multicultural society. However, the conflict between Arabs and Jews intensified in the 1930s with the increase of Jewish immigration driven by persecution in Europe and with the Zionist movement aiming to establish a Jewish state in Palestine. In November 1947, the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution partitioning Palestine into two states, one Jewish and one Arab, with the holy city of Al-Quds under a UN administration. The Arab world rejected the plan, arguing that it was unfair and violated the UN Charter. Jewish militias launched attacks against Palestinian villages, forcing thousands to flee. The situation escalated into a full-blown war in 1948 with the end of the British mandate and the departure of British forces, the declaration of independence of the State of Israel, and the entry of neighboring Arab armies. The newly established Zionist forces launched a major offensive. The result of the war was the permanent displacement of more than half of the Palestinian population. In 1948, 1.4 million Palestinians lived in 1,300 Palestinian towns and villages. More than 800,000 of the population were driven out of their homeland to the West Bank and Gaza Strip, neighboring Arab countries and other countries of the world. As early as December 1948, the UN General Assembly called for refugee return, property restitution and compensation, Resolution 194. However, 75 years later, despite countless UN resolutions, the rights of the Palestinians continue to be denied. According to the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, UNRWA, more than 5 million Palestine refugees are scattered throughout the Middle East. Today, Palestinians continue to be dispossessed and displaced by Jewish settlements, evictions, land confiscation, and home demolitions. The Nakba anniversary is a reminder not only of those tragic events of 1948, but of the ongoing injustice suffered by the Palestinians. The Nakba had a profound impact on the Palestinian people who lost their homes, their land, and their way of life. It remains a deeply traumatic event in their collective memory and continues to shape their struggle for justice and for their right to return to their homes. In 2022, the UN General Assembly requested that this anniversary be commemorated on 15th May 2023 for the first time in the history of the United Nations.
يا رجال الوطن هبوا للنضال